Welcome to POTUS 2016, where we call the presidential horse race and pour cold hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Less than 1 week to go, and suddenly we have a nail-biter. Races often tighten near the finish, but this late October surprise, the renewed investigation into another trove of emails, has shaken Hillary Clinton's campaign. A week ago, she was confident, even redeploying resources to down-ballot Democrats. But now Donald Trump, who had been reeling from his lewd Access Hollywood video, is gaining confidence because the very FBI director, James Comey, who had only scolded Clinton before, has handed him new ammunition. So Trump's cry that the system is rigged against him didn't work so well this week and had to be modified on the fly.
It might not be as rigged as I thought, right? Right? The FBI. I think they're going to right the ship, folks. I think they're going to right the ship.
But will these late developments matter much? 30 million plus have already voted. Most minds are made up. We'll check the latest polls in a minute. Also on today's program, obstacles to voting in light of Trump's veiled threats, what's considered legal poll watching, and what's intimidation. Plus the ground game explained, and in our evidence-based politics segment, a scholar details the nuances of bringing out the women's vote, crucial if Hillary Clinton is to win. But first, are we actually talking photo finish? Yes, one final time for the horse race, and it has become an even tighter race, one that shows just how fragile Hillary Clinton's lead really is, according to Nate Silver over at 538. As of Wednesday, our deadline, Silver's Polls Plus model predicted that Trump's chances of winning are now up to 31%. Why? National polls have shown Trump gaining on Clinton and the gap narrowing over the last 2 weeks from 7 points to about 2. This has been largely due to a rise in Trump's numbers as Republicans come home to their party. But if the gap continues to narrow, Clinton's swing state advantage could fall away too, providing a much sought-after opening for Trump to begin chipping away at her electoral college firewall states. Popular vote trends would likely influence the electoral college as state polling moves in sympathy with national polling. As an example of this, we can look back to mid-September, when the race was tighter nationally, as in this graph, and Clinton was trailing Trump in about half of swing state polls. But for now, Clinton's numbers remain consistent. Polling conducted since FBI Director Comey's announcement has yet to show much downward pressure on her. A recent HuffPost YouGov poll found that just 5% of respondents learned something new about Clinton from Comey's announcement, and 52% say it confirmed what they already thought of her. Morning Consult's tracking poll also found little movement in the race in recent days, with Clinton holding the same 3-point lead over Trump as she did last week. And in Pennsylvania, an important swing state and window into the Rust Belt, Susquehanna Polling and Research released results on Wednesday that showed Clinton still ahead by 2 points, which was just a 2-point narrowing since last month. Monmouth Polling also showed merely a 2-point erosion of Clinton's support, and she still leads by 4 points, all of which would be consistent with October surprises in the past that have usually only managed to move the polls 1 or 2 percentage points on average in the final 2 weeks, according to 538's Harry Enton. But even if we ignore the pro-Trump trend in the popular vote, Clinton could still be in trouble. There could be a slight error in polling, a la Brexit. Given the number of undecided voters in a year with 2 very unpopular candidates, it's a distinct possibility. In online polling conducted through Monday by Purple Strategies, Clinton narrowly beats Trump by 3 points in a 4-way race among independents, but with 16% of those independents still undecided. What also matters is turnout. While Clinton appears to have the upper hand, cracks could be forming in the coalition that Obama built in 2012 when African Americans and younger voters turned out en masse. Women will also be crucial. We'll get to that shortly. But right now, let's talk about the voting process. What happens if your name isn't on the list? Where does poll watching end and intimidation start? What exactly is this ground game everyone says Hillary has more of? And can she count on the big African American turnout that boosted Obama and helped her win the nomination? Joining us, voting rights expert, attorney Adam Gitlin, counsel in the Brennan Center for Justice Democracy program. Gitlin spent 7 years in the U.S. Justice Department as an investigator and litigator. With us as well, political strategist Chet Whye, former campaign director of Harlem4 Obama. He knows the ground game. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for
Adam, when we say poll watcher, people have been throwing that term around so loosely lately. What is a poll watcher under the law, and what do you have to do to become one?
So it's a good question, and I think part of the reason for the confusion is that we do have 50 states. Each has their own law about how you can watch at the polls, if you can watch at the polls, if you're not a voter. And the important thing that I think everybody ought to know is that in most states, you actually can't just walk up to the polls and decide you want to watch an election. You actually have to be credentialed ahead of time, and there may be certain restrictions on who can be a poll watcher. Oftentimes, there are states that require you to be from the same county as the place that you want to watch, for example.
Like Pennsylvania, which tried to loosen the rules for being a poll watcher, right?
Some folks in Pennsylvania have tried to loosen the the policy. Right now, the law is that you have to be from the same county as the place where you want to watch, and there are efforts that folks have undertaken to try to loosen those laws so you can come from anywhere in Pennsylvania.
Why that restriction, in particular, county lines?
I mean, the reason that it makes sense to have local restrictions is if you're going to actually challenge who a voter says they are, and Pennsylvania does limit who can challenge and on what basis on Election Day. You can only challenge someone by saying either they don't live at the place they say they live, or that this is not the person they say they are. You can't say, I don't think so-and-so is a citizen. You have to limit your challenge. And the reason, in a sense, makes sense because you want to make sure that whoever's posing that challenge is somebody who knows you're not you. So they should be someone who lives near where you live. The reasons that people are saying that they want to change that rule is so that they can battle voter fraud, which is really a problem that is vanishingly rare.
Chet, I gather you're watching Philadelphia in particular, too.
Watching very carefully, yes.
Which means what?
Well, it means a lot. During the Obama campaign, we recognized that we could pump up the vote in New York, but we would be fools not to use that energy to go into the next battleground state. So with the enthusiasm we had in New York in 2008, we got people on buses, and we sent them down various times during the week and every weekend to areas inside of Philadelphia to get people registered and get them to really be focused on the vote. That worked remarkably well during the primary, and it worked well during the general election. This time around, we're doing the same thing. We go full body, as we say. You can take a bus down and get about 2,500 to 3,000 door knocks in one day with that one bus. So we're using our energy in New York to try to deliver the battleground state, and especially concerned about Pennsylvania because of the small margin that she has.
And Trump keeps mentioning Philadelphia by name as an example of a place where, that's one of those areas where, we'll be watching in Philadelphia. What do you make of that? Why Philadelphia?
Philadelphia is the target of a lot of the New York support that we have gathered to put down. I mean, it gets us a lot of votes in a little bit of time. And for him to mention it, he's trying to really put the eyes on Philadelphia and put the hands on the vote in Philadelphia, that people will step in and somehow try to alter the success of Philadelphia, because Philadelphia could save the state.
Are you worried about actual intimidation at polls in Philadelphia, and then we're going to go on to other states. But because Philadelphia seems to be such a flashpoint, you know, the Trump people are urging their voters to go to the polls wherever they are, so maybe suburban Philadelphia, and then go to another area, and he says other areas, and he says cities, and, you know, maybe see what's going on.
Well, I'm still waiting for them to show up in the area around Temple University where we start off. So that'd be a nice walk back to the car.
Yeah, it's also, I think it's important to remember that everybody should still go vote. If there happen to be people, you know, trying to misbehave in some ways, election officials are well aware of, you know, the same stuff that we're all reading. They are gearing up. Pennsylvania has issued special guidance about appropriate polling place conduct and voter intimidation so that they know the rules. So folks should really be heading to the polls confidently and voting.
Right.
Are you concerned about violent skirmishes, if not worse, on Election Day? I mean, even Chet just said, and I know you said it with a wink.
I was joking.
But, you know, it'll be a nice walk back to your car. But that kind of language is creeping in there, serious or not.
There are obviously, you know, everything that has happened everything that could happen under the sun has happened at one point or another. And again, election officials are generally well used to having to prepare for, you know, having folks who don't entirely know the rules showing up at the polls, but they are taking a lot of extra steps in not just Pennsylvania but other states as well, and we expect that they'll be ready to handle it. And if for whatever reason people are concerned that things aren't going to be handled well, they can always call 866-OUR-VOTE. It's a nonpartisan election protection coalition that'll help you resolve problems that you see at the polls.
And nationally, there was actually an article on Politico citing and with a picture of a neo-Nazi leader, an actual neo-Nazi American leader, saying we're going to go out to polling places and intimidate people who aren't for Trump. Are you worried about that?
Yeah, and he was probably standing on a soapbox and looking over his crowd of two when he said it. So, you know, a lot of this is bluster. A lot of this has happened before. It's more intense with this candidate because he brings out the worst in people. But I'm really not concerned at all about real intimidation. I think the most intimidation is to talk about what could happen, and that's where it lies.
And I mentioned in our horse race segment at the beginning of the program that there's lower black turnout in the early voting, and some of the biggest swing states, Florida, Ohio, North Carolina, are early voting states than there was in 2012.
There is.
Can you talk about North Carolina and Florida at all?
Well, I you know, we've been watching that since the primary, and I was a Bernie person during the primary, and whereas Hillary really packed it in as far as the black vote, the votership was actually down, and that was a concern with all of us because it really boded for how the November election was going to be.
In other words, in
tougher.
winning over Bernie Sanders, she got fewer total black votes than Obama got in winning over her in 2008.
That was the problem, that the votership had diminished, and that was a problem around the country.
And we're seeing it now.
Somehow, near the end of the primary, it picked back up.
Ohio, same thing?
Ohio, same thing. You would see that the total vote in 2016 was pretty robust. It wasn't 2008, all right, but it did recover.
Just in North Carolina in particular, there's that new voting law, which people consider a voter suppression law. And one of the things that I've read that it does is reduce the number of early voting sites, and that may be suppressing the African American vote. Do you think that's happening in that way? It
does suppress the vote. It gives you less outlets to push the vote, and the municipalities actually choose which sites are going to be open. So depending upon who's making the decision,
the local,
who controls the local.
Are you concerned about that? Do you have a reason to think that it's got a disparate impact by race?
Oh, I don't think there's really much question at this point. So the North Carolina law was one of a number of laws that went into effect after a recent Supreme Court decision in 2013. And previously those laws would have had to get some sort of clearance from the Department of Justice, and these laws have now been challenged, and court after court has found that they do have a disparate impact on people of color, often on students, urban residents, those with disabilities, and in fact, in North Carolina in particular, the appellate court found that the law was passed with the intent to racially discriminate.
All right, stay there, guys. We're going to bring on some additional evidence. Time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. Every presidential race since 1980 has seen a gender gap, with Democrats garnering more votes from women than men, Republicans doing better among men than among women. But some pollsters say this year is a whole other story, with women favoring the Democrat Hillary Clinton at historic proportions. Is it simply that the Democratic nominee is a woman whose opponent has said inflammatory things about women? What about so-called women's issues? Though women do vote in larger numbers than men, what strategies work getting out the women's vote, maximizing it? Joining us to discuss this on Skype from Camden, New Jersey, is Kelly Dittmar, professor of political science at Rutgers University and scholar at the Center for American Women and Politics of the Rutgers Eagleton Institute of Politics. She's the author of Navigating Gendered Terrain, Stereotypes and Strategy in Political Campaigns. And still with us, Adam and Chet. Professor, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Could you clarify for everybody what metric the term gender gap actually refers to? Because I think people misunderstand it and use it overbroadly.
That is very true. So we calculate the gender gap as the difference between men and women's votes for the leading or winning candidate. So if you look at, for example, 2012, when Barack Obama won 55% of women's votes and 45% of men's votes, that was a 10-point gender gap. Other outlets will define it differently, but for us, that's the clearest way to look at the actual difference between men and women's vote preferences.
And what is it this year, according to the average of the polls? And I've heard Trump supporters say, oh, sure, Trump has a gender gap with women, but Hillary Clinton has a gender gap with men.
Yeah, which is, again, another misuse of the term gender gap, right? Because it's between the two, men and women. But if you look at averages, it's really hard to tell across these polls. As you very well know, you've been talking about, the polls are sort of all over the place. But we did do an average at the beginning of October. We were looking at this and trying to measure about where we might be at. At that point, looking at national polls, the average was around 13.5-point gender gap. So it is larger than the max that we've had since 1980, which was 11 points, and of course the 10-point gender gap that we saw in 2012. So it may in fact be bigger this year, but that's in part because of not only Hillary Clinton doing well with women, but Donald Trump doing particularly poor with women and trying to increase his support among men.
From what I've seen, there's a big gap this year between college-educated women and non-college-educated women. Is that bigger than in the past?
Well, actually, there was a bigger gap in the primaries, right? So you saw a difference in terms of their support for Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton. That was really generationally guided. In other words, younger people were voting for Bernie Sanders, just as younger people have voted for the most progressive candidate in most Democratic primaries. As you come into the general election, the numbers of young people coming to the Clinton ticket and voting for Hillary Clinton are incredibly, large. The strong majority of young people are going to vote for Hillary Clinton. That's young women and older women. A recent poll the Harvard poll on young people also demonstrated that young women were still more likely than young men to be voting for Hillary Clinton. So I think some of the generational difference between young and older women is a bit hyped. In reality, most young women are still going to vote for Hillary Clinton, and in fact in higher numbers than young men.
But I think we saw in the primaries the gender gap neutralized let me get this right, not neutralize, but age was a bigger factor than gender, or don't you think that's right? Because younger women were going for Bernie.
Sure. So the gender gap is the primary motivator of the gender gap is party. So party identification is why we've seen the gender gap be so strong since 1980. Women are more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate. It doesn't have to do with the fact that the candidate is a woman or a man. So it's not surprising to us. We, in fact, wouldn't expect there to be much of a gender gap in a Democratic primary. What was interesting about this primary is that there was still a gender gap with women still more likely to vote for Hillary Clinton than Bernie Sanders. It's especially interesting because if you assume women are more likely to vote more in a more progressive fashion, then you would have expected them to actually be more likely to vote for Bernie Sanders. So to your point about generational difference, that definitely was making the difference when you looked at older women versus younger women. I would say the primary indicator there was youth or age instead of gender.
Does all this get you thinking, guys? How about you, Chet, as a strategist?
Well, I've seen the excitement that black women have had for Hillary and the promise of a presidency under Hillary, and I think that has been a surprise to some people, not really a surprise to me, and I see it as a further extension of the breaking of the ceilings. You know, we broke a ceiling with the first black president, and we're busting a big old hole in the ceiling with the possible election of the first woman president. I hope that women pay attention to the lessons learned by African Americans globally with the election of Barack Obama. And that is that you have to not only elect, but you have to support issues that are progressive for women in this term, if Hillary gets it, and be very vigilant about it and make some ground. You have to be out there.
Adam, we talk about voter suppression tactics being aimed at minorities, racial, ethnic minorities. We don't hear about it being aimed at women in particular. Is there a gender-based voter suppression effort?
Not really that I'm aware of. There are. It is true that a lot of the same laws that have disproportionate effects obviously are going to on other groups are going to have effects on women. Rarely do you see a law that looks like it was designed specifically to target women. So if I'll give you an example, right? Texas has had one of the strictest photo ID laws in the country and had a very strict list of IDs that would be permitted. And you could use your concealed carry permit to vote, but you couldn't use your University of Texas issued student ID to vote. That's very clearly geared at students because we know very clearly that they're the ones who are probably most likely to use that as their form of ID.
So you don't have to be a citizen to get a student ID.
Also true.
To our knowledge, in terms of the statistics, what we see is actually women are turning out at higher rates than men, even despite some of these efforts. We've seen, again, since 1980, women turn out at higher rates than men overall. And when you talk about black women, they actually turned out at the highest rates of any other race and gender subgroup in both 2008 and 2012. And just to add to that, 96% of black women were voting for Barack Obama. So these challenges, of course, I think, as was noted, probably affect women to the same extent as they affect men. But we are also seeing women pretty passionate about turning out, and that's been pretty consistent throughout at least the last couple of decades. And for black women, I think it speaks to the importance in this election of a Democratic candidate, of a Hillary Clinton, being sure that she ensures the same level of enthusiasm and turnout among black women.
How much does the gender of the candidate matter? For example, I heard Gloria Steinem say, well, she wouldn't have considered Sarah Palin if she had been elected vice president in advance for women because she didn't support what Gloria Steinem considers pro-woman policies. And I think we see the gender gap express itself such that even women who are running on the Republican line do worse among women than the Democrats. So how does the gender of the candidate versus the party and the views of the candidate play into this?
Yeah. So we typically, in sort of shorthand, talk about it as, party trumps gender in this case. Women voters, just like men voters, are most concerned about party identification, and that is a cue, of course, for positions. Political positions, ideology, policy positions. So it is not the case that just because you're a woman candidate, you're going to get more votes from women, or vice versa, because you're a male candidate, you're not going to win women voters. I do think the attention to the issue in this campaign, in some ways, has allowed us to sort of educate the public about that misconception. But also there is something to the energy around the campaign when you do have a woman candidate. So I don't want to discount the importance of having women on ballots throughout the nation. We have found some evidence in the literature that just having a woman on the ballot engages voters who might otherwise feel marginalized from the political system. And that's not just women, but it may be minorities or other groups, that they see somebody who's sort of breaking down the barriers to the system, and it might encourage them to be engaged, whether to talk about politics more, whether to vote more, whether to get volunteer for a campaign. So I think when we look at the impact of having a woman on the ballot for the presidency, those are the places where we might see more effect than necessarily at the ballot box.
We've only got about a minute left. What's the biggest thing that you would say by way of a viewer's guide? What should people be watching for on Tuesday and Tuesday night?
I think most important, people should be going and voting. They should know that no matter what kind of watching is allowed, every state bans voter intimidation, and anybody who's disrupting an election is going to be removed, so go and vote.
Chet, same question?
Yeah, I think that people have to be very diligent, even till the polls close. And they should be calling their neighbors and calling their family members and everything. This is really going to be a long night. This is not going to be a really easy night. I think it's going to be close for a while, and then Hillary is going to pull it out. But we're going to be pins and needles, I think.
I think Ohio, North Carolina, Florida, all closed at like 7:30.
Yeah, I think we may have a little bit of a problem because the momentum seems to be going Trump's way, and I hope that Hillary pulls out the Trump card by playing the First Family
we will
a
see
lot
what
in
happens.
the next couple of days.
We'll see what happens in the only poll that counts.
Yes.
Thank you all very much for joining us, and that's POTUS 2016 for today. In just a few days, this long, strange trip will be over, and we should know, we sure hope we'll know, who will inhabit the White House for the next 4 years. We'll dig deep into the results next week, and yes, we'll continue to be here each week examining the public policy choices that the next administration must make on taxes, education, security, climate change, and more. So after the voting's done, monitor the Oval Office with us. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.